What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So I want to finish off this point guards thing. At number one, I mean, it's no real surprise here. I have Magic Johnson. Um, it's pretty much he's pretty much the consensus choice for greatest point guard of all time. I know there's some new age people that think that the owner will eventually go to Stephen Curry. I don't see that, but I do think that Curry has a shot at ending up as a top three all time point guard when everything is said and done. So Magic Johnson, first I want to go through his accomplishments real quick. Don't want this video to drag as long as some of my other ones have. But Magic Johnson was a five-time NBA champion, of course, won back-to-back in 1987 and 88, and he was the first player, well, his Lakers were the first team to win back-to-back since the Celtics in 68 and 69, 20 years earlier. Three-time NBA Finals MVP in 1980, 1982, and 1987. Three-time NBA MVP 1987, 89, and 1990. 12-time NBA All-Star, two-time NBA All-Star Game MVP, nine-time All-NBA First Team, All-NBA Second Team in 1982, the NBA All-Rookie Team in 1979-1980. The Rookie of the Year award went to Larry Bird that season. Four times he's led the NBA in assists: 1983, 84, 86, and 87. Twice led the NBA in steals. He won the J. Walter Kennedy Citizenship Award in 1992. Of course, he was on the 50th anniversary All-Time Team in 1997. His number 32 is retired by the LA Lakers, of course, and he was the NCAA champion in 1979. He was the NCAA Final Four Most Outstanding Player in 1979. Consensus First Team All-American 1979. Second Team All-American in ABC 1978. Third Team All-American AP and UPI 1978. His number 33 is retired by the Michigan State Spartans, and he was a McDonald's All-American in 1979. And as an executive with the Lakers, he won five additional championships as an executive during the Kobe Shaq three-peat, and then the Kobe headed Lakers in the late 2000s, 2009, 2010. Uh, Magic Johnson, in his rather abbreviated career, scored 17,707 points for a 19.5 points per game average, grabbed 6,559 rebounds for a 7.2 rebound average, and dished out a whopping 10,141 assists for an all-time record 11.2 assists per game average. And of course, he won Olympic gold in Barcelona in 1992 with probably the greatest team ever, the 1992 Dream Team. Magic Johnson's story begins um, in 1959. I believe he was born in Lansing, Michigan. Um, Unlike a lot of players of his generation, 50s and 60s, he was not born in the Deep South. He didn't deal with a lot of deep rooted and frequent racism. Not to say he didn't deal with it all, but he didn't deal with it to the extent, say, an Oscar Robertson did, or a Bill Russell did, you know. He had more of a upper middle class upbringing. His father, I believe, was a longtime employee with General Motors, and his father actually had a side business hauling garbage. So the family was actually very well to do for a black family. Now, I do believe they lived in a segregated neighborhood, but it was a nice neighborhood, um, in the 1960s. As a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I read that Magic didn't really encounter racism until Michigan began to force um, integration as far as busing is concerned in the 1970s. And I think it was when he was either in middle school or high school, might have been middle school in the 70s, when Magic first really encountered racism, had someone call him a nigger and other racial epithets. But the thing that made Magic sort of immune to that, um, his personality is not one given toward. Uh, he's not a person that is especially given toward uh, holding grudges or having deep resentment toward other people. And also, what helped him was when he became a star basketball player, it kind of removed the racial stigma from him. So like, what was that movie? Was it School Days? I might be getting my movies mixed up, but I think it was School Days when John Turturro's character, who was a seething racist, right, didn't like black people, but he liked Magic Johnson because he didn't see Magic in that racial prism, that racial light. He saw him as a great basketball player. When you see someone through uh, a different window, even if they're another race, you just look at them differently. Like how like a lot of white people looked at Sammy Davis Jr. They didn't see a black man, or no, put it like this: they didn't see a nigger. They saw a very talented black man. You know, uh, but you get what I'm saying. So that was a way that Magic was able to kind of deal with racism. He got the nickname Magic for the way he was a magician with the basketball. And Magic Johnson eventually sprouted up to 6'8.5", listed as 6'9". And at that time, in the late 1970s, you just didn't see that. When you saw a person that was 6'9", if you're scouting in the night, let's say 1977, and you're scouting a talent, and someone tells you that the guy is 6'9", the first thing you think, is this guy a power forward? Is he a center? Um, Maybe a small forward, a big small forward. You're not thinking a perimeter player, let alone are you thinking a point guard. Keep in mind at the same time in the NBA you had Bob McAdoo, who was 6'9", who was a center slash power forward. You had excuse me, you had Dave Cowens, who was a center at 6'9", 235. You had the great Earvin Hayes, the Big E. He was 6'9", 230, 235. You know what I'm saying? Um, for Magic Johnson to be 6'9" and be a point guard and to have the skills to be able to do it, and have the court vision and all of the skills requisite to be not only a point guard but a great one, was such a it was such a moment of evolution of basketball. And Magic Johnson, in his own way, as did Larry Bird, because Larry Bird was 6'9.5". Really, Bird was, if you round it up in shoes, 6'10", the way they were listing players until recently. You know, Bird really was 6'10" if you want to go by how they were listing players for the last 25 years before they decided again to list them bare feet the last couple of seasons. Um, but yeah, these guys really were the precursors to the LeBron James and the Carmelo Anthony's and all these great big players, Tracy McGrady, all these tall, big guys who have guard skills that we didn't used to see 40 plus years ago. But Magic Johnson was a star player in high school. He was a winner in high school, and that translated over into college when he went to Michigan State. Um, Excuse me if in the past I've said that he went to University of Michigan. That was incorrect. Sometimes I get those schools mixed up when I'm talking. But when he went to Michigan State, of course, he won an NCAA championship, as I mentioned earlier, against Larry Bird's Indiana State in 1979, which was the genesis, the lead up to that, and the championship game, was the genesis of what will be their rivalry in the NBA, which after 1984 or so slowly began to be a friendship. Although Bird said the friendship was more on Magic's side than on his side. Um, so Magic Johnson was the first overall pick in the 1979 draft, and Larry Bird was actually um, his rights were actually registered by the Boston Celtics in 1978, but he did not actually play for them until 1979. Magic was younger than Bird, so but Bird was he first played for them in 1979 when he was 23 years old. Magic was only 20 years old, barely 20 years old when he got to the league, and he instantly made the Lakers, who were a really good team at the time, but he made them into a different type of organization. He created a different dynamic for Kareem that he didn't have since Oscar Robertson. And the Lakers dethroned the Seattle Supersonics as the best team in the Western Conference. The Sonics at that time had went to back-to-back finals in 1978 and 79, ultimately winning in 79 against the then Washington Bullets. But the Lakers won the title in 1980 in dramatic fashion. Kareem went down in game five. The Lakers were up 3-2 after that game, but Philly thought they were poised to win. It'll be sort of like now if, let's say, the Clippers, even though it's not the finals, but let's say the Clippers and the Lakers are playing against each other, right? And the Lakers have a 3-2 lead, but Anthony Davis goes down. He's not playing the next two games. If you're a Laker fan, you're really nervous because how are we going to make up for such a loss of a great player? But Magic Johnson played center. He started at center in that game, and he had one of the most dominant performances of his career, the most dominant at the time of play. 42 points, 15 rebounds, and 7 assists. Um, and the Lakers won the title. The next year would bring some challenges. I believe it was that year that, well, was either 81 or 82. Somewhere in that time frame, someone could correct me with the exact time. I want to say it was 80, 80, 81 that Magic signed that he restructured his contract. I think he signed something like a 25-year, $25 million contract. He was the first player in the NBA to make $1 million. Salaries were really growing at that time. Mind you, 5 years earlier, a big salary was $450,000 a year, like with Walt Clyde Frazier or somebody like that. Now Magic is making $1 million. The NBA is growing. Fans are starting to flock to the NBA to watch this rivalry between Magic and Larry. You know, people like to credit Jordan with the boom. Jordan kind of took it and maybe pushed it a little bit further, but the real boom started with Magic and Larry. All right. Julius Earvin kind of carried the league for a little bit. He kept it afloat, but they really took it off. And then you had a lot of other great players coming into the NBA at that time too. So it wasn't just those two, but they were the two main superstars. But focusing on Magic in this situation, that big contract that Magic signed did lead to some jealousy issues with certain players. They thought he was getting too much too soon. He didn't really deserve a lot of the praise and adulation he was getting at that time. At that time, people were saying Magic was the greatest point guard of all time. Mind you, he had only been playing for a year and a half. Okay, so this didn't just happen where people are getting premature um, accolades. You know, now in hindsight, it sounds ridiculous, but you know, to say that Magic was greater than Oscar at that time is blasphemy. Now, no, now it's not blasphemy to say it. But anyway, the Lakers only won, I think, 54 games that year, and they lost in the playoffs to the Houston Rockets. All right, and the next year they rebounded and won the championship in '82. 1983, nobody was beating the Philadelphia 76ers. That's one of those all-time great historic teams. Like the 2000 or the Kevin Durant Warriors. I would have said the 2016 Warriors, but really the Kevin Durant Warriors. The Bulls with Jordan, Kobe, Shaq. Like there are just certain teams they just steamroll, like the 2001 Lakers, the '67 76ers, the '72 Lakers. There's just certain teams that are just destined to steamroll. They're not going to be denied. And the 83 Sixers were not going to be denied. They swept the Lakers in four. The next year, fans got to see the matchup they've been dying to see, and that is Lakers versus Celtics. All right. Now in '81, Larry Bird had won a title of his own. At this time, Magic had a lead of two championships to one, having won it in '80 to '82. Bird had won a championship in '81. So this was also, in many people's eyes, a rematch of the 1979 NCAA championship between Magic and Larry. It was during this series where Magic's reputation took a hit. During this series, Magic weaknesses were exposed. That was his outside shot. Basically, Boston just dared. First of all, they proved to be tougher than the Lakers in that series physically. The Lakers were a better team to me overall, talent wise, but the Boston Celtics proved to be tougher in that series. And they also exposed, as I was saying, Magic Johnson's weakness, which was his outside shot. He did not have, at that time in his repertoire, much of an outside shot. If you look at early Magic footage, it kind of would remind you a little bit of Ben Gordon. You know, he sort of was more of a slasher, more of a scoring in the paint guy, might shoot a 10 to 12 footer, but really didn't have much range outside of maybe 14 to 15 feet. Out past that, he really didn't shoot much. But they were daring him to do it. He was bricking. Also, he was uncharacteristically making bad decisions with the basketball and turning the ball over in certain times that that usually he came through in clutch. And then Boston ultimately won that series in seven. And Magic, it got so bad for Magic that they started calling him Tragic Johnson. So over the next offseason, Magic worked on his game. Now it didn't happen overnight, but you could see some improvements. Um, and over the next 5 to 6 years that Magic Johnson played, you could see a gradual improvement in his mid-range game to the point where he eventually, by 89, 90 into 91, he extended his range to three-point range, but he could, knock it down at a decent clip for that era. You know what I'm saying? He had one year where he shot it at a 36% clip, which would be on average for a player this year, this era, excuse me. So he worked on his outside game. He worked relentlessly on what was considered weaknesses. Magic Johnson was never a great defensive player. I would say he was a slightly above average defensive player. Um, he was a great rebounder for his position. To average 7 rebounds a game, even though he was 6'9", to be a point guard is phenomenal. He was a better scorer than people give him credit for. He wasn't a great shooter, but he still averaged 19 points a game in that system. You know what I'm saying? That's still a decent point total. Keep in mind, I believe that's right on par with Isaiah Thomas, who I believe averaged 19.7 points per game. So they're pretty identical. Even though Magic is considered more of a pass first point guard, Magic averaged about the same amount of points. Um, but when need to, Magic could score. He could drop 30, 35, 40 points on you when need be, if it necessitated, if it was necessitated, excuse me. Earlier in his career, Magic was a gambler on defense. That was seen in how he was leading the league in steals per game a little bit early in his career. He led the league twice in steals, as I mentioned earlier. That's because he was kind of gambling with, going for steals and trying to get in the passing lanes and whatnot. But oftentimes when you do that, you do get burnt. Over time, Magic stopped doing that. He did become a slightly better defensive player in my opinion. But one of the knocks on Magic, he didn't have blazing speed. He wasn't the fastest guy. And against smaller point guards, he could you know, he could get. He had moments where he get lit up. He had moments. We all remember Eric. We all remember Eric sleeping floor with the 51. He could get lit up, but more often than not, he was decent on defense, especially considering he was 6'9". 85, the Lakers come back. They play against Boston. The first game was the Memorial Day. The finals happened a little bit earlier back then. It was called the Memorial Day Massacre, or sometimes the Boston Massacre. Boston won by like 34 points. At one point, I think they were up by 40 something. It looked like they were going to beat the shit out of LA. But Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had other plans. The first game of that series, Kareem looked really old. He didn't look good. Kareem came back and played vengeful basketball the rest of that series. Won Finals MVP. Even though he's 38 years old, he just played lights out. And the Lakers won what would be their third title. The next year, they lost in the semis, I believe. Someone can correct me with that. I believe they lost in the semis to the Houston Rockets off of a Ralph Sampson shot. Either it was the Western Conference Finals or the semis, and which was unforgivable for Laker fans to not make it the big dance. Unforgivable. And after '86, the Lakers for 4 years. 1986-87 is considered the best year of the Showtime era for the Lakers. Best year. It was also a bit of a changing of the guards, so to speak, for the Lakers and for the league a little bit. A little bit. Um, at that time, 86-87 marked some changes. Julius Earvin, that was his last year. That was the rise of Air Jordan. His first, I'm just naming different players and situations. Jordan's rookie year was tremendous. Next year, he broke his foot. Had the breakout game in the playoffs against the Celtics. 86-87 was the first year he was Air Jordan to the point where what I mean is people were starting to look at him and saying, man, this guy might be the best player in the league. This guy's the best player in the league. That type of shit. Boston was beginning to show their age by that year. Injuries were starting to affect them. 86, that was their best team. 86-87, McHale broke his foot that year. Didn't lay off to get the surgery because he wanted to go through the grind of winning a title. It affected him, and it was the same player after 86-87. 86-87, Bird was still great, but it was one of the last 2 years that Larry Bird was really Larry Bird. The Detroit Pistons were starting to come. That's why I wanted to say these different things. With the Lakers, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had been, and is still to me, the greatest Methuselah until LeBron James passed him in scoring, was finally at age 39 beginning to show his age. And this is when Magic Johnson had to take the lead in the offense. Magic, who had been before maybe been averaging more like 17, 18 points, now he was leading the team with 22, 23 points a game. Still was a team effort, but he was becoming more and more the first option. But this Laker team was phenomenal. I think they won 65 games that year, if I'm not mistaken. And they went on to win the title against the Boston Celtics. Magic with the iconic hook shot over Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale. And ultimately they won that series. I think it was in 6. They vowed, or really Pat Riley vowed, to win a title again, a repeat in '88. Put a lot of pressure on LA. By '88, Boston had been dethroned in the East by the Detroit Pistons, and it was a very, very, very tough battle for LA in that final. Some people tell you, Pistons got screwed. I'll tell you this, it just went down to the wire, but LA was able to prevail. Magic had won his 5th title, and now people were starting to look at Magic and say, Is this guy going to be the greatest player of all time? 88, 89, the Lakers are still great. They won 57 games that year. In the playoffs, they put it on another level. They went undefeated. And when you look at who the Lakers were playing in the playoffs that year, they weren't playing against bums. By that time, the Western Conference had gotten stronger. No longer was it like how it was in the early to mid '80s, where they're playing against a bunch of bad teams. Now you had really good, potent. You had the really dangerous Phoenix Suns with that high octane offense, high scoring, dangerous players like Tom Chambers and who else was on that team? Tom Chambers, Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, Jeff Hornacek, all these great scorers. Eddie Johnson. They swept them. You know, the year before that, they played Utah Jazz, which was the breakout year for Karl Malone and John Stockton. You know what I'm saying? So the West was changing. Olajuwon was rising as a force. But then injuries, maybe just the grind of going to the finals year in and year out. First, Byron Scott went down. Then Magic goes down. And that was it. You know, the Pistons were able to beat the Lakers for nothing. Uh, After that, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar retired. Uh, the Lakers were still a really good team, but they weren't quite the same team. They didn't have the same pieces, and they were in something of a rebuild, a little bit. Still were a really good team, but some of the pieces they had, some of them were getting older, so you got to kind of rearrange, got to add some new pieces. The Lakers were transitioning from being sort of that up and down, Showtime team to being more of a half court team. Magic was getting older, but he really wasn't showing any signs of slowing down from a dominant standpoint. Maybe a little bit on the defensive end, but as a player on the offensive end, he still was very dominant. In 1991, in his last full season in the NBA, Magic Johnson pulled off, um, an upset. He led the Laker team that won 58 games. It was a really good team, but nobody expected them to beat Portland. And they beat Portland in the Western Conference Finals on the upset. And they made it all the way to the NBA Finals. And they played the Bulls. And as much as this is hard to believe to some people, a lot of people thought Magic Johnson and the Lakers would beat the Bulls because the Bulls just didn't have an experience. A lot of people just didn't trust Jordan's teammates in high pressure situations. But they proved to show they proved that they were a different team than they had been in years past. And even though they did drop the first game off of that Sam Perkins 3-pointer, they went on to win the next 4 games in rather convincing fashion, and they won their first title. But tragedy would strike the NBA just months later on. Magic Johnson during the 1991-92 preseason was looking dominant, looking great. During the preseason, he was getting triple doubles after triple doubles. Like I said, he wasn't slowing down at all, man. This was a guy that was 32 years old, still looking great, even though his counterpart, Larry Bird, sadly was struggling in what would be his last season. I think he only played 45 games or something like that. 40 something games his last season. He really struggled at the end with his back issue. But Magic Johnson was not struggling physically from an injury standpoint, but he was struggling with a virus that would that would become known soon. I think it was after, either during or after they played Utah. If I remember certainly correctly. I remember reading about this. I think it was after the preseason game in Utah. Magic started feeling fatigued, started feeling sick. I think he first attributed to maybe like altitude issues, but this persistent feeling, maybe he thought it was jet lag or something, but his persistent, you know, feeling of illness and fatigue, it wouldn't go away. And then he got a call from the team doctor of what the problem was, and Magic was told, I think it was November the 7th, 1991, that he had HIV. And At the time, you got to remember, HIV was seen as a death sentence. We had seen many people, many prominent individuals, waste away and die, from Rock Hudson, Liberace, you know, Keith Haring, you know, Isaac Asimov, and at that time, Freddie Mercury, who had been really prominent in the news. Many people, wondering whether or not he was really sick, because they were keeping it hush. Queen and the group, they started, they saw evidence that, of course, he was dying. He was losing weight, wasting away. Of course, uh, Freddie Mercury would die, I think, 2 weeks after Magic Johnson made his announcement. So this is a different world. This is when AIDS was a death sentence. So when Magic Johnson announced that he had AIDS, it was like basically, you're thinking, oh my God, we're going to watch Magic Johnson wither away and die in front of us. Arguably the game's greatest player, you know. And it was at that point where some of the ugliness began to come up. Rumors that, because a lot of people still saw HIV as a gay man's disease, rumors that he was gay. Unfortunately, these rumors were put out there by none other than a person that he thought was his good friend, Isaiah Thomas, one of them. Many players, Karl Malone, feared. Karl Malone, I think, was one of them. Chris Mullin might be another one. I think he was one of them. I can't remember. But I do remember vividly Karl Malone being one of them, saying, I don't want to play against this guy because I might get sick. Even his own teammates, he said, treated him differently. Didn't want to play hard against him. And, that led to Magic just deciding to retire. He did come back because had he been an active player at the beginning of the season, he was voted into the All-Star game, won All-Star game MVP, performed brilliantly in that game. And this is something that people forget. Magic Johnson had actually planned on coming back for the 92-93 season, but the same vibe that people had about, I don't know, I don't want to play against a guy that has that, that resistance that he was getting from that vibe, that players didn't want to play against him. He decided to call it quits. Magic Johnson went on to be a coach for the Lakers for, I think, 16 games into the 93-94 season until he called it quits. And then Magic Johnson did finally decide to come back as the stigma against HIV was changing and going away, and more effective treatments were being um, implemented that no longer made AIDS a death sentence. The climate was changing a little bit by the mid late 90s, so he did come back in the 95-96 season, obviously motivated by Jordan's comeback at the same time. And he played 37 games for the Lakers. Sometimes looking like a great player, sometimes looking old, much heavier at 255 as opposed to the 215 to 220 they played in his prime. A lot of that probably a side effect of the steroids that he was taking to counter the wasting factor that can happen when you have HIV. But ultimately, he retired. Now, there's some there's a little bit of discrepancy as to why he retired, because they lost. The Lakers lost in the first round, I believe, to, who was it? Who did they lose to in the first round? Was it Houston? I think it was Houston. Maybe it was Houston Rockets. And I think what happened is Magic didn't want to continue playing, but I think that he got a vibe that the Lakers kind of wanted to move on. They were going to make a trade. They were going to make that big push for Shaq, and they were. You could argue the Lakers were going to like a youth movement at that time, a changing of the guard for the team they had, and maybe Magic Johnson didn't fit into their plans. But I gotta say this: That opportunity to have Magic and Kobe on the court at the same time would have been phenomenal. You know what I'm saying? And also, Magic didn't want to play point forward anymore. If need be, he probably would have lost a lot of weight to play point guard again, but maybe Magic wasn't in their plans. But I think it's stupid, in hindsight. And Magic retired for good. But at least I want to end this video on this. And I said I'm going to make this video long, and I've been speaking for 35 fucking minutes. But I want to end this video on this, right? Magic is one of those guys you wonder what it could have been, what could have been with his career had he not got sick. Now, I don't think he would have ended up with 15,000, 200 something assists like John Stockton. But I do think that his numbers would have been so impressive that at the end of the day, you couldn't question his overall greatness. So that's Magic Johnson. Tell me what you guys think.